Presenters for the day. First, my co-collaborator in putting this session together, Mollie Quinlan-Hayes, Executive Director from NCAPER, is here today. She'll be taking the second half of this session. And I'm really pleased to present Seth Tinkham, who's the National Coordinator, Natural and Cultural Resources at ESF 11, the Continuity and Resilience Planner for the Environmental Response and Recovery Division, Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance at the U.S. Department of the Interior. I hope I got that right, Seth.
That's a lot, but yeah.
We are going to actually start with an overview from Seth on how FEMA and the Department of the Interior can respond in accordance with the ESF 11 function to assist state arts agencies in protecting and managing cultural resources when your local capacities are overwhelmed. So probably heard enough from me for now. I'm going to turn things over to Seth. Seth, if you'd like to take it away.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for everyone for joining for today. I am here from the Department of the Interior. I'm going to be talking mostly about disaster response, but we also support disaster recovery. And I see some familiar faces from Los Angeles who can probably speak more on a personal level about how disaster recovery works in impacted communities. Our office is many things, of which just a small part is the disaster response and recovery side of the world. We don't need to dwell too much on this side, but I just wanted to show that there are other things that our office does related to remediation of abandoned hard rock mines or oil spills or hazardous substance releases. ESF 11, like I was saying, and the recovery support function for natural and cultural resources are just one of this larger picture. I think it's important to not make assumptions. So what we just wanted to illustrate here was kind of some of the other parts that are included within the Department of the Interior. We have many other offices and many other bureaus. But for the purposes of the conversation today, what I also want everyone to keep in mind is when we're talking about the technical assistance and the people that we can bring to disaster response and recovery, yes, of course, we're talking about all the bureaus and offices that are here on this screen, but also our ability to reach out across the executive branch as a whole. So the response and recovery people that we might be able to help bring to impacted communities is not just limited to the Department of the Interior, it's actually the entire executive branch as a whole, plus Library of Congress, plus the National Archives as well. So what I thought we would do here is just make sure that we're all starting from the same place. And this place is disaster response and recovery. And so I just wanted to pause quickly and make sure that we're all clear kind of on the same thing. You can see in this slide that the event, the incident, if we want to use FEMA's language, that might trigger a disaster declaration under the Stafford Act, which is kind of the key first thing for us to be involved. That this event is about at the 1 o'clock position in this wheel, and that event corresponds to that response quadrant that you see there. And then we move into recovery, which might be better thought of sometimes as long-term recovery. But there are a variety of other phases in which kind of incident management or disaster management occurs. Today, we're going to focus on response and recovery. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I thought that it would be helpful to just kind of break down some of the steps of things that are going to be happening after that incident or event in the language of the previous slide. And to kind of illustrate opportunities for your organizations and units of government to maybe make some outreach or advocacy or phone calls or just kind of talk to people across the state about what you're seeing and what your needs are so that they can get connected better to the emergency support function side of the world, which is disaster response, and the recovery support function side of the world, which is disaster recovery. So if we look at this timeline here, there is an incident or event, like I was saying, that the previous slide calls it. Immediately before or after an event, that is a great opportunity for you to be reaching out to your state emergency management agency or your kind of the lead state agency in your state that that you fall under in your state emergency response plan. And that is definitely a piece of homework that I would give everyone, is if you're not already familiar with your state emergency response plan, locate yourselves within that and see who your lead state agency is. It might be yourselves, I don't know. For many other natural and cultural resources institutions at a state level, it's the Department of Agriculture for many states, not all. And so that might be a bit of an unexpected spot to find yourself, and just making sure that you know who a person is at the Department of Agriculture and the State Emergency Management Agency, and maybe even your governor's office, to start to elevate some of the issues that you're seeing in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, as well as for long-term recovery purposes. The key phrasing or the key thought that you're trying to articulate, I would say, from at least a federal perspective, if the objective is to request federal assistance, it's justifying or explaining how the incident is beyond the capabilities of your government to respond, and that you have unmet needs. And that unmet needs phrase is really one that I want to make sure everyone takes home, because that is where we can step in and provide assistance, is to help meet those needs. So to go back to the flow chart here, I talked a little bit about how before or after an incident is a great spot to reach out to those people. There also will be after an incident what's called a preliminary damage assessment. And that's where staff from FEMA and also state officials, I think of it as going out into the field to validate that the scale and scope of a disaster that has happened. And then from that can come a disaster declaration request. And I'm speaking here again from the federal level. So that's a federal major disaster declaration request, which is made by the governor. That is another opportunity where you can make sure that natural and cultural resources are not only captured during the preliminary damage assessment, so participating however you can in that, but then also making sure that that evaluation translates into a request for assistance if needed and wanted, right? We're not trying to show up if you don't want us to be there, but that there is a way to make sure that your interests are represented in that disaster declaration request, which ultimately goes to the FEMA regional office and then FEMA headquarters, and then for presidential action. After that, there is going to be a disaster declaration that will time bound when the incident period is, and then also geographically assign counties and other areas, parishes, where a disaster has occurred. So the declaration itself will come out with a time period and also a geographic area of interest. And then it is possible to appeal that. I just wanted to highlight that. Um, Again, I've been kind of peppering this through all along, but my intent here was just to try and write down some specific spots phase by phase where some outreach could happen, and the people to whom you can be doing that outreach. So like I was saying at the beginning, I work in the Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance, that's OEPC. On a state level, a state could reach out to us with some needs around the time an incident occurs, and then also around the time of that declaration. And that would be very helpful for us to hear from you all, because we're also trying to make contact to you with you once an incident is looking like it's going to be happening. If we are activated by FEMA, we're doing that as FEMA's phone a friend in a way. FEMA can't be the expert in everything. And so for issues related to natural and cultural resources, they turn on, if you will, Emergency Support Function 11, which is agricultural and natural resources. And then we're kind of located within that. They'll turn on Emergency Support Function 11, and then we will begin outreach to. I usually try and reach out to the chief state wildlife official, maybe the state wildlife veterinarian, the head of the state archives, the state historic preservation office, other organizations like that, or parts of state government, to try and understand what needs might be. And so I'm just trying to show here when you might expect to hear from our office. Again, the key trigger is a Stafford Act major disaster declaration. And then I was talking about before, there are a couple times throughout the disaster phases when there are good opportunities for some advocacy or outreach on your part to communicate to other parts of the emergency management framework on what some needs are that you might have. Broadly, we are here to help. We have a pretty generalized definition of what natural and cultural resources are, and you'll see that in a few slides. But I just wanted to emphasize that it's a pretty holistic, elastic ability that we have to look at cultural and natural resources, and we can bring the technical expertise that the federal government has, if that's something that you think would benefit your state response, and that we can do that in a very wide variety of disciplines, and it can be at a bringing planning folks in, but it also could be, for example, bringing in a paper conservator or something like that, if that discipline is helpful. So it's a pretty broad and also specific level of expertise, again, where requested. So I'm joining with you all today, as I was saying before, for this ESF 11 role. But what does that mean? What's going on? There are 15 emergency support functions. We're not going to get into all of them, but what I'm just trying to show here is, again, this idea of phone a friend. Not all of these ESFs are the primary responsibility of FEMA. Many of them are sprinkled around other parts of the federal government. And then ESF 11 has landed with the Department of the Interior. Again, just wanting to emphasize that it's possible that your state may have emergency support functions that mirror these pretty closely, but there's no guarantee. So I really would recommend pulling your state emergency plan and taking a look at what that looks like on a state level. A lot of what ESF 11 has translated to recently has been condition assessment, survey, field work to understand on a field level what the impact of a disaster has been. But we don't do that alone. We do it with a wide variety of partners like NCAPER, like the Heritage Emergency National Task Force that you see on this screen, and of course FEMA itself. So there are just a lot of inside and outside the government resources and people that are here to help if that's something that would be helpful for you all. Once well, it's easy to think of life working sequentially, but we know that's not the case. So what we're seeing here more and more often is that disaster response is ongoing as disaster recovery ramps up, and those two phases can kind of operate simultaneously. One of the key ways to differentiate between disaster response and disaster recovery, I would say, is the length of involvement. Disaster recovery work, which is the responsibility for natural and cultural resources, also for the Department of the Interior, through my colleague Jennifer Wellock, who's sitting behind me right now. Disaster recovery is a longer term contact, and so can allow us to have a certain depth to projects and recovery efforts we don't really have necessarily at a response level, because the timeline is slightly compressed. You can see that of the 15 emergency support functions, the recovery support functions are concentrated down here to just 6. So these are, once the life and property concerns that are present in an emergency or in disaster response are kind of in the background, these are the concentrated efforts. And you can see the lead agencies here. And again, the Department of the Interior is the lead, continues to be the lead for natural and cultural resources. This is the definition that I think I'd really like everyone to focus on for what we mean when we say natural and cultural resources. It's very broad for natural resources, and I would say it's equally broad for cultural resources. It's the built environment, it's archaeological resources, it's archives, it's libraries, it's museums, it's the full variety of collecting institutions that really speak to our cultural traditions. On the long-term recovery or recovery side of the world, there's a planning function that I was talking about before that we can assist with. There's a preparedness function that we can assist with, not to mention the specific technical assistance that we can provide. And we'll see what that means specifically here in a couple slides. These are some examples of some work that we've been doing. Some of this actually is taking place or will take place shortly across California as part of that response. Right now, we're supporting efforts in St. Louis for tornado disaster response there, whether that's architectural survey, workshops on a private, on a personal level, or just more organized kind of policy development or guidance to collecting institutions. other activities that we've been involved with are bringing in experts to host clinics or technical assistance actually in a specific institution. This slide is kind of inside baseball. We don't need to get into it, but what we're just trying to show here is that we pull people out of their regular jobs and we drop them into the FEMA response and recovery framework. So it's not that this is an employment opportunity, but we're just temporarily taking the brains of people in the federal government and getting them out into the field in ways that we hope will be of assistance to you all. I don't want to get overly focused on the behind the scenes stuff, but this mission assignment concept is one that I think is important to pause a little bit and kind of walk through, because this is where the request that you have made, whether that's through your emergency management agency onto the governor's office to FEMA, to the governor's office directly on to FEMA, or maybe even to a FEMA regional office and on through the processing there. This mission assignment, this is what tasks the Department of the Interior, go here and do this thing. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what is this and what are some spots that you should be aware of along the way. So again, through this this mission assignment process, you can see that there is a time period, a specific request, and an instruction that is provided. In our case, to us, to the Department of the Interior, to do something related to that disaster response or recovery for natural and cultural resources. There are two types of mission assignments. One is called federal operational support. That's where FEMA says, hey, come help the federal government do this thing related to disaster response or recovery. Usually it's the Department of the Interior, come help FEMA do this response or recovery thing. But what I want to point out to you is there's a second type. It's called direct federal assistance, where we can respond to that request that a state or tribe has made for some specific technical assistance as part of disaster response or recovery. There can be a cost share. It can be between 0 and 25%. If it's important to you that that be waived, you need to ask for that. So I would just kind of, put a pin in that as something that might be part of, might be important to be a part of any conversations that you're having with, again, a governor's office or a state emergency management agency as you're thinking through potential unmet needs, to go back to that key phrase. And again, direct federal assistance must be something that you ask for. The next few slides here are just meant to try and show all the things that are going on before an incident, again, or an event. So here we're monitoring what's going on. We're trying to make contact to state wildlife agencies, arts agencies, state historic preservation offices. FEMA is doing the more life safety things behind the scenes in terms of moving people and gear and food and stuff. This is also a time where you can start to talk to us about what some of your needs might be. And also a time where you can start to talk within state government about what your potential needs might be. While the disaster is going on, we're continuing to do outreach. FEMA is fulfilling its mission and protecting life and property. And FEMA will start to receive or process the requests that they've received for assistance and translate those into mission assignments. Again, think of that as tasking based on subject matter expertise to different parts of the executive branch. And if there's something that's included for our side of the world, then it would come to us. We do have a regional structure as well. We have regional offices that operate to support the recovery support function and emergency support function at a regional level. And if that's ever something that would be helpful to have me share out with you all, please let me know. After a disaster, if we don't receive a mission assignment, we kind of will stop monitoring a situation. If we have received a mission assignment, then we're going to step in and be there for response and recovery needs, whether that's on the FEMA side or the state or tribal side. After plus, I made that up. I'm just trying to allude to this idea that there is a longer term aftermath, if you will, to a disaster and a spot where we still can be present for recovery support. These are my last few slides because I want to make sure to leave time for questions and for other folks to chime in here. But I just wanted to show that, particularly for Hawaii and the Maui fire, we were able to partner with the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative and the Heritage Emergency National Task Force and other conservation-focused organizations to provide some technical assistance. In that second bullet, you'll kind of see how we compose that response team. And what do we do? This wide variety of tasks is what was supported by that. You can see there's some on-site work, there is some planning work, and there's some more workshop, I guess I would call that action-focused work that was done to prepare a variety of cultural resource professionals in Hawaii for response and recovery efforts. These are just some pictures from those variety of activities. And that is it for my portion.
Thank you so much, Seth.
Mhm.
I did receive a few questions, and I'd
Sure.
like to encourage anyone else who has questions, just enter them in the chat. We're going to have a quick Q&A break here with Seth about his presentation. First question I have, is it possible to have someone from the Department of the Interior, ERRD, provide training or tools that are tailored for arts and cultural institutions on kind of practical matters as far as like who to contact, when to contact, what does risk mitigation look like, etc.
Yes, I think we can do that. The kind of steady state world that we live in, yes, absolutely. We could help with that and facilitate some connections to technical experts. Absolutely, yes.
Great. I have one kind of in the same vein, more of a pre-event question.
Sure.
How can state arts agencies kind of better communicate the role of arts and culture in helping strengthen the community resilience, getting them to prepare so that it's resonating with your priority. So they're
Sure.
kind of, I guess what they're getting is how can they better get their constituents and themselves set up so that it aligns
Mhm.
uh, as far as communicating that is.
Sure. I think there's a couple different spots. I did talk about the state emergency response plan. Um, I would say not only is it good to read that, it also would be great to find out when the next revision is going to be and make sure that state art agencies are clearly and conspicuously represented in that response plan. That's going to be the framework on a state level for what response looks like. Another opportunity that I would recommend folks consider if they're not already is the state or regional hazard mitigation plan and making sure that any risks or hazards to state art agencies uh, museum archives, library are represented in that hazard mitigation plan, and that the risks are adequately captured as are the hazards. I think it's easy to think that plans sit on a shelf, but some of these actually are pretty action oriented plans, and being in the plan can mean you have a seat at the table. I would also say another action opportunity would be to attend maybe a state emergency management agency conference and talk about how are art museums, archives, and libraries represented in our statewide emergency management agency as it begins to build out its response efforts. I see Kristen Sakota is here from the County of Los Angeles, and she may be able to talk about on a county level, kind of what that looked like. Not trying to put Kristen on the spot. So I think planning opportunities are really something that I would encourage folks to take seriously. And then the final one is just go back to what I was saying before about if it is the Department of Agriculture in your state that is your lead state agency, or whoever that lead state agency is, making sure that you're talking to them, because that may not be something that they're thinking of if they're usually dealing with a statewide agricultural and food safety issues.
Thank you. And that actually leads into the last question I have, which is who within our state structure is the best person to make contact with and have a relationship with to access these funds and stuff? Is it Department of Agriculture? Does it depend on the state? Is there like a particular kind of person that you can point folks to?
I think I think I would go back to what I said before. I think unfortunately this is going to have there are going to be three answers. One is going to be your state emergency management agency. The other one is going to be your lead state agency that the archives falls under, and then the third one would be whoever your contact is in the governor's office. Um, as you all can imagine, the and you all have lived through this. I don't have to tell you this, but the volume of information that just picks up before, during, and after a disaster is so big that having multiple spots to do outreach can be very beneficial.
Great. Thank you very much, Seth. I
Mhm.
hope you'll stick around with us through the rest of the session. I am going to shift things over to the second half. Before I do so, I'd like to encourage those of you who are comfortable doing so to come on camera. We're hoping to run the second half of this session as much more of an interactive dialogue. Mollie will be running us through this. Mollie, of course, from the National Coalition of Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. We'd like to have a conversation with you and to kind of talk through kind of your experiences. So Mollie, I'm going to pass things over to you to lead us through that. And again, feel free, we'll be asking you some questions in chat, but feel free to come on camera and join us as part of this conversation. Mollie?
Great. Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Seth. That was a really rich overview of what state arts leaders can know and some of the roles that they can be active in. So thank you for that. And yes, we do have a special guest today, Kristen Sakota from the County of Los Angeles. So in just a few minutes, we are going to ask her to relate her experience leading the response and recovery in the recent Los Angeles area wildfires. But I know that we do have some folks on the call here that have unfortunately had to be a leader after a disaster in their area. So, and you may have interacted with FEMA and Department of Interior. So I'm just curious if are any state arts agency staff here who would like to relate any experience that they have, questions, reflections that might be helpful to set the stage for our conversation. No volunteers. All right. Well, that's fine. This is a conversation, so you can feel free to jump in anytime. But I will then ask Kristen to come on microphone, and thank you for being here today. Although Kristen is not a state arts agency leader, she does run a county arts agency that covers, I think it's 80 municipalities in a vast geographic area, as well as unincorporated areas of the county. And so there are a lot of similarities, I think, with what a state arts agency might face. So could I just ask you, Kristen, to briefly share your experience? Obviously, you've been through disasters such as COVID, but we're just going to focus today on the January wildfires and just kind of what role you were in and how your activities intersect with what we're talking about today.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I'm somewhat familiar with the fantastic work of NASA and Pam Bro, who I have the honor of serving with on the Board of Grantmakers in the Arts, and have worked with Mollie as well as Seth right now on the response to the LA wildfires. So glad to see this conversation happening and contribute where I can. I'll just say for the January wildfires, as I'm sure many of you know or saw, on television or what have you, we had, an abrupt sort of experience that was quite intense, lasted several days, and we are a very large county. We're actually the most populous county in the United States with about 10 million people, give or take, maybe a little less. Um, and it is about 4,000 square miles and 88 incorporated cities within it, and then over 100 unincorporated areas. And the wildfires were so widespread that they impacted multiple areas of Los Angeles County, including unincorporated areas, included incorporated areas, what have you. And I said that to say that in any situation, we all know as government or quasi-government, agencies that we all sit on the public sector arts side, that the complexities of jurisdiction are also something that are always at play, and how we navigate that when at the end of the day, artists, cultural organizations, and communities do not care and should not have to care whose jurisdiction it is or which boundary it crossed. What they really just want is support and help and recovery. So with all of that, because of our role as the LA County Department of Arts and Culture, I knew immediately, and because of past things like COVID, that we would be called into service. So of course, the first thing I did was just make sure my staff was okay, because we were all really in literally the line of fire for, I mean, I can't remember anymore. I like blocked it out, a week or two, however long it was, we were all kind of on tenterhooks. And so after ensuring we were okay, I really pulled everyone together to assess what role we could play. And where we landed was the first thing really was engaging. The first two things were really engaging in multi-agency coordination. So, and thanks to Mollie and the team at NCAPER, they too have played this role around the country. And we were connected to them as well. And they said, we're happy to host a call that could happen weekly, or later it was bi-weekly, to just take that off our plates and help be an organizing body. And so on those calls, plus other independent conversations and meetings, we talked with everybody from the National Endowment to the Arts to eventually the people who were mission assigned, like DOI and others, NCAPER, our local cities and their Department of Cultural Affairs from, City of LA, Pasadena, Santa Monica, others who were impacted, arts service organizations of a variety of kinds. And we also knew that bringing and consolidating information to our field was going to be huge, because people are just trying to navigate so much at once. And so we immediately knew one of the first other things we would do was stand up a webinar, which we did. It was the first week of February when it happened, and we invited a variety of speakers. So we had FEMA talking to the arts sector about how do you apply for FEMA, or is there anything arts specific, etc. We also had philanthropy. Our colleagues at the Getty Foundation were able to launch a program that ended up funding about $15 million to support artists, impacted in the fires. So they were on. Our very own LA County Department of Economic Opportunity, who had state funding and small business funding, and they were giving grants for dislocated workers and creative businesses, amongst others. And so all of those, putting that together to share information for the field, was another big part of what we did. I will hold, but just say we also are deeply engaged in a number of programmatic strategies that may be of interest to this group, that I'm happy to talk about on this call as well. But I just want to uplift, before I turn it back to you, Mollie, maybe one or two other pieces that are a little bit higher level thinking. One is to say, in my experience in this, and I'm not an expert in this the way some of these other folks are on this call, but in my experience from COVID to, I was in New York City before, so Hurricane Sandy, 9/11, all the things. Two things. One, sadly, some form of disaster or crisis is going to hit all of us, nationally or locally, and preparedness is important for all of us. And that in this one, though, for some reason, a couple of things have been very clear, even though every disaster is different. It's been very clear to me that I'm thinking about this as like a two-sided coin. And the first side is, how do we in our roles ensure advocacy, resources, and efforts to address the impacts on the arts sector? Artists, cultural organizations, creative businesses, as Seth was talking about, cultural heritage, tangible and intangible cultural practices of our communities. They are going to be impacted. They may be physically impacted, burned, lost, damaged. They may just be impacted by, like, communities being all, strewn apart. They can't come back together around their cultural practices, etc. So how do we address that? But the flip side that's been very clear, and which I've taken it as my role to also advocate for, is that arts and culture is also a vital tool for the recovery of the whole community. So we need to always be advocating for arts and culture, because healing-centered arts programming, or cultural spaces as spaces of gathering, or civic art or monuments as part of the rebuild, creative businesses as part of economic vitality. And we saw our friends in North Carolina speak so eloquently about their craft artists and how that plays a role in the economy. It's also an opportunity to talk about address the losses. So I call it sort of the loss model and strengths model. Advocate for we need resources because this is part of also all the larger pieces that the entire recovery is trying to put back together. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to you for where you want to go next.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. I'll hold and see if anyone has any immediate questions for Kristen. Well, I guess my
I
first
had one,
question,
if I could be so bold.
please, Seth.
Well, I really appreciate the good job that Kristen did to making sure that recovery wasn't just about looking towards what we needed to bring forward from the past, but also making sure that there was a spot right now for arts. And that really is a big lesson that I will take with me. But my actual question was, how did the nature of the disaster change how you designed and executed your communications plan?
That's very interesting. Yeah, I mean, in some ways it did, and in some ways it didn't. It didn't in the sense that we have common tools that we use in our, I call it communication sort of architecture, but like the pieces we use. Many of them are digital. So our website, we do a monthly newsletter that goes out to thousands of folks on our list. We have social media platforms as well. And so those were still the main platforms we used. But one thing that we did do, and this was a learning from COVID, is that in COVID, we had stood up a digital resource center, we called it, on our website. In other words, a whole section of our website that had recovery grants and relief opportunities and information. And so we essentially stood up a new page centered on the wildfires. And so that helps people who, again, are really trying to aggregate information and go to a trusted source. So that was one thing we did that was different. And then the other thing was, as I mentioned, just all the different agencies involved in a disaster like this meant that, instead of doing a webinar or sharing information solely about like an arts funder, here's what the Getty Foundation's offering, we wanted to span across. So having somebody from FEMA, somebody and local and national, somebody from MusiCare, somebody from, SURF, that was a little bit more unique for us. So those were a couple of strategies that were a little different than what we typically would do. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll put in the chat, actually, thank you, whoever shared our general website. I'll actually put in the chat, that link goes right to the section of our website that I mentioned. And I'll add one other thing, which is we were able to collaborate with the Smithsonian on their rapid response. I think I saw that, Seth, in your, part of the timeline, because just like I'm sure state arts agencies probably do, I know local arts agencies, we have a lot of data. So our role for technical assistance can also be helpful. And so we have reach to our grantees, but we also have information about those grantees or about, local artists. And so we were able to partner with the Smithsonian because we were doing our own mapping of which of our 500 grantees were located in fire zones or fire evacuation areas. So we could share that with the Smithsonian, and they folded it into their rapid reporting on cultural heritage more broadly. And so we were able to collaborate together. So you'll find all of that in addition to the resources on the website.
Great, thank you. I have one question for you, and then I'm going to pull up a graphic. And this, I'm not sure if this is for Seth or Kristen or anyone else who's been in this position on the call. And Seth, you talked a lot about the work that you all are able to do in cultural resources, much of that being the built environment, physical collections, and assets. First of all, I just wanted to thank the federal government because it was only in like 15 or 20 years ago that arts got added to the definition of cultural resources. So that was a win. But we also deal with a lot of things that are not about physical, tangible things, performing arts, time-based arts, things like that. So I just am throwing that out because I wonder where or if that fits into some of this, either in the preparedness or the response space in terms of what DOI is able to offer, or how you might help us think about finessing those kinds of needs into what you're able to offer.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the things that always pop to my mind are things like storytelling and dance, which it's not controversial to conceive of either one of those as being an element of arts, but more often than not, I find are not necessarily represented in definitions or frankly policy. Um, I think this is a bit of a non-answer, and I apologize, but what I think we can best help with is answering a request for assistance once it comes in. Does the Department of the Interior or the executive branch maintain a fleet of choreographers to zoom in at a moment's notice to assist? No. But we do have those types of people here in the federal government. I mean, there are millions of people that are in the executive branch, and having those experts to reach out to, whether that's oral historians or just, a huge network of people, I can't unfortunately give a menu to a community, or we can't give a menu to a community. We have to listen and respond to what they say, and we won't know necessarily what the answer is until we get to ask. And I think that would be the biggest thing that I would emphasize is ask, particularly for, as Kristen said, intangible resources, which are not necessarily as well represented always, again, in definition or policy.
Thank you.
Could
Kristen?
I add something, which is just, I think also, and I'm sure this depends on the context. I'm sure it depends also on the leader and kind of your orientation and things like that. But and kind of your positionality, I guess, is a little bit how I'll say it. But for me, I do subscribe, I guess, kind of to like a more proactive, I guess, kind of approach to if I see a need or an opportunity to assert, that's what I'll use, to assert the role of arts and culture, I will take it. And so when it became clear to me that there was going to be a FEMA declared like federal style, task force type of thing created, and it was going to be created at the LA County level. And I knew this not only from the meetings that we were starting to have with Mollie and everybody, but I knew this internally because of where I sit as an official department head of LA County. I now am on the same, level, so to speak, as the Department of Parks or Office of Emergency Management or whoever it is. And so we were told by Office of Emergency Management that they were about to set up this FEMA task force structure, and it would have typically these kinds of, task forces within it, rebuilding or, whatever the different ones are, health and human services, natural resources, et cetera. And so immediately I saw that that's going to help identify the needs and the recovery strategies, and then the resources people will be seeking. And so then strategically, that's an important place to be. So natural and cultural resources is one of them. So I thought that's where I want to be. And economic recovery, arts is part of that, especially a place like a Los Angeles or North Carolina or wherever. So I saw sort of the strategy in it and I went for it. Had I not, I didn't have to respond. It was just like all departments, if you fit in one of these, let us know if you want to serve on it. I could have not responded at all. I could have been like, I don't know, that's not for me, and just done what I did. I could have responded, but then sat quietly and thought, oh, I'm out of my depth. I don't know if this relates to the arts. I did none of those things. But I will tell you, in doing that, it meant that that I was engaged. And because of the role we play, it meant arts sort of was definitely going to be part of the understanding of cultural resources. And in the end, because I also spoke up in the beginning, so, passionately about it, they were like, can you lead the cultural resources working group within, cultural natural resources task force? So I ended up, playing a little bit of a leadership role on that. And I was very pleased to find that FEMA's definition, because I looked it up, it's like, how are they going to define this? I looked at the language of, like, I went into some of the documents at the federal level and was pleased at that definition. I think it's really great the way it talks about tangible and intangible cultural practices and things. I think it's very instructive. What I think could possibly be more instructive, and Mollie, we can all support you and NEA and anybody else, is to continue sharing out concrete, maybe case studies is maybe the way to go, or examples, so that when people see that language, they immediately can find, here are examples of how that's been used, and they will see both like architectural heritage, but they will also see dance, and they will see healing arts education in schools, and they will see these, and then people in our field and beyond will know that that is one, appropriate interpretation.
Great, hugely helpful. Thank you, Kristen. As I mentioned, I know we're running up on time, but I'm going to share this graphic, which this is a test run, but in preparing for this conversation today, I thought it might be helpful to think about how, as a state arts agency leader, you can be active in all of these phases of the emergency management cycle that Seth has introduced to us. And I'm sure that this is incomplete. In fact, I've been taking notes while Kristen and Seth have been talking. But I'm just going to walk us through this quickly just to kind of get your brains thinking a little bit. And there's a little, so you'll see preparedness at for left, followed by response after an event, long-term recovery, and then mitigation, which is reducing your risks. And we've divided this into statements or actions that are in red, which is really for your own agency, and ones that are in yellow, which is what you can do. I'm sorry. C is for things you can do for your constituents, and SAA, things that you can do within your agency. Some of these we have observed working really well in agencies. Others, people have said, we would love to be able to do this if we had the know-how or if we had some help. So I'm just going to introduce this and say that NCAPER is interested and willing to work in all of these areas with our state partners. I didn't do a quick blurb, but NCAPER is the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. We'll celebrate our 20th anniversary next year. We were founded in the wake of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita to do kind of the two things that Kristen said. Make sure that artists and arts organizations and arts sectors, because they are so vulnerable, get resources before, during, and after a crisis at the level they deserve. And the other side of the coin, supporting communities in using the arts as healing, as economic engines, as ways of processing disasters. So just quickly, and you've heard some of these things already from Kristen and Seth, you can, starting here at the upper left, create an agency readiness plan for if something happened to your own agency, or if something happened to a group of your constituents. Designating a coordinator in your agency. Doesn't have to be the executive director, but someone who is the point person for information coming in and information going out. Again, building relationships with your state emergency management agency and understanding the disaster relief management system, that flow chart that Seth shared with us. Providing training for constituents in preparedness. We use the statistic that $1 in mitigation saves $13 in recovery. So anything that we can do to lessen risk, make ourselves more resilient ahead of time is a win. And then looking at your grant budgets, you can send really important signals by, for instance, including a budget line in your grant applications for preparedness steps or preparedness investment, and asking if your constituents have readiness plans. Lower left in mitigation, identifying a battle buddy, finding another agency that can work in your stead or be a mutual aid if something were to happen to your agency. Supporting constituents' resiliency, again, and that could be a whole, set of webinars in itself. And cross-training staff, so that if a key personnel, a member of your personnel is suddenly absent, you're going to be able to keep your agency operations, critical operations going. Over at the top right, and I think this is what we heard a lot about today, making sure you have existing connections with cultural heritage organizations, your SHPO office, your state library and archives. Most states have one or more SARAs, which are cultural emergency response associations, or heritage emergency response associations. These are voluntary collectives that deploy in the wake of a disaster for physical assets. As Kristen so eloquently said, positioning the arts as an asset and a partner in recovery, empowering your coordinator in your office to make these kinds of connections, doing the assessment of what the needs are so you can take that information back up. And we actually have a tool that we make available to assess the impact of a disaster, large or small, on your arts community. Again, becoming an information hub. Kristen mentioned and put a link to the page that they set up. And really, we know that the local arts councils are where people are going to go primarily for information. So, working in tandem with your local arts agency colleagues in the impacted area. Easing restrictions and expediting grants. Emergency funding is very different than general merit-based funding. So a whole different ball of wax. And trying to distribute needs-based relief grants. And finally, in the long-term recovery, advocating for arts and culture, advising the extant relief system and local philanthropy about the unmet needs of the arts, providing data to policymakers, and keeping the arts on the radar. Some of these events, it's going to take years, a decade or more, to recover. And so keeping the arts on the radar when people's attention is going elsewhere is really important. So that was just a quick run through, and I'm interested from anyone on the call, Kristen included. Does this resonate with you? Are there things that are missing here? Or like, I'd invite you to think about what's one thing that you could do off of this list quickly that might, get you just that one step closer to being ready to respond and act in a disaster. So would love comments, feedback, critique of these concepts. And your reflections on anyone who's been active in one of these and would have an experience to share. Okay. Well, I know that Eric will share this graphic along with the recording of today's webinar. I know we're coming up on time, so I am going to ask Kristen if she has any, or Seth, if they have any last minute nuggets of wisdom to share before we toss it back to Eric to wrap.
I don't have anything else to add, but just thank you all very much.
And I just want to say thanks as well. And I agree with Shannon, who just posted in there that I love the graphic. I also love that mitigation, and also I think in Seth's materials, that preparedness. I love that those kinds of things are expressly part of it, because I think even if you're not in an active disaster, right, response, it still gives us all something to do. And I would love any examples of any of the things you mentioned on there, Molly. Like if anyone on this call or anyone else has examples of how they incorporated disaster response in grant applications. Like you were saying, it's a line item on your project budget. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen that. So I think those kinds of examples nationwide would be wonderful.
That is a great idea. Thank you, Kristen. And I'm just putting my contact information in the chat. Happy to hear from anyone after this call.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you again, Seth, Molly, and thank you, Kristen, for sharing your experience and expertise on this call.